Welcome to the MCAT Basics Podcast, brought to you by the physicians at Med School Coach. Each week, Sam Smith breaks down high-yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Welcome to a bonus episode of MCAT Basics. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to Dr. Shirag Shemmassian, who is the founder of Shemmassian Academic Consulting. I think his name is somewhat synonymous with MCAT prep and kind of some of the academic resources that you get when you're applying to med school. So thanks a bunch for coming on. It's really an honor to have you on. So the first thing I was kind of curious about is, you guys have a lot of fantastic guides to secondary essays, a lot of good blog articles for, some of the MCAT topics. And I know you're a clinical psychologist by trade. So how did you get into the admissions, specifically the med school admissions space in the first place?
Yeah, great question. So I guess it goes way back, Sam, to when I was in high school. I went to a very, very small private high school in Los Angeles. It's an Armenian high school, and we had very little college counseling. And so, for folks in that community, staying local was really important because, the Armenian community is very tight and folks wanted, family members nearby. And I always had different, aspirations. And so I was self-taught and, ended up getting into Cornell for my undergrad. And, when I was there, I was pre-med the entire time. I actually did quite well, graduated a 3.9 plus. Wow. And I was doing a lot of work in research at the time in mental health. And I grew up with Tourette syndrome as well. So I always had a heart for, for individuals with disabilities or mental health conditions and things like this. And I was helping a lot of people along the way, people from my own community back home who wanted to have, similar levels of admission success. And they were very successful. And when I was pre-med, helping others get into medical school. And from then on, it was just organic through word of mouth as people were having increasing levels of success and just really, finding value in that narrative storytelling approach that's really prized for applications. The request got to a point where I was like, I really enjoy helping students pursue their academic and career goals. I also just really enjoy getting to know students, getting to know their stories. And it just took off from there. And over time, obviously, as I've developed more and more resources and, work with a number of, current and former adcoms just routinely in my day-to-day. It's just not only, it's turned from a passion into something much, much more. And it's just a pleasure to develop the types of resources and support the students that we do.
That's awesome. Another question I kind of just was thinking about in doing a little research, about your company is how familiar are you with the LSAT for law school?
Pretty familiar.
Okay.
As far as what's involved in the exam, no, not to the same degree as the MCAT, of course. But let me know what your question is.
Yeah. So I was hoping you could settle this debate. So my significant other right now is a law school student, and she claims the LSAT is harder than the MCAT, and I think there's no way. But what's your opinion on that?
Oh man, I feel like I'm gonna upset somebody no matter what I say here. So thanks, Sam.
Yeah.
No, I'm teasing, of course, but I think they have unique challenges.
Okay.
I think each exam has a section that is just very different than the kind of thing you have to do in school, right? And so this is probably not going to come as a surprise for anybody familiar with the two exams. So with the MCAT, the section that tends to stump the most people is CARS, right? So the critical analysis and reading, and for the LSAT, it's the logic games, right? It's sort of the way a lot of pre-med students feel about CARS is the way many law school applicants feel about logic games. Does that sound familiar, Sam?
It does. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So which one's harder? Boy, I suppose it depends on the way you think. And, for the LSAT, the logic games, requires something very different than you learn academically. You're given these scenarios and, you obviously have to think about, what information do you have and not have, what assumptions are in there and so on. Whereas with CARS for the MCAT, it's of course very different. You get, these passage-based questions, and you have to figure out, main ideas from them and so on. So that's the big key. From a purely endurance standpoint, people would say like the MCAT, there's just much more content. It's a very long exam. I think if you asked, most pre-med students, they would say the MCAT. I assume this is not based on any evidence that some folks who are applying to law school might concede that too. So I'm balanced. Again, don't hate me, law school folks, but I would say the MCAT.
It's okay. I don't think there's many law school students who listen to this podcast. So
right,
you're,
but
you're
if
safe
word gets
that.
out, figured it's worth it.
Okay, so kind of what I wanted to do in this episode is something I haven't done before, is just really kind of do an intro to the MCAT, talk about what is the MCAT, how do schools look at it, etc. Maybe people who are just starting to study might find it helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So with that said, could you maybe first talk about the 4 sections that make up the MCAT and maybe talk about which one is hardest for you?
Yeah. So as far as the second question, I'll get to in a moment.
Okay.
So the 4 sections are, chemical and physical foundations of biological systems. So most people call that chem phys.
Mm-hmm.
Next one is CARS. So that's the critical analysis and reasoning skills. And then biological and biochemical foundations of living systems. That's biochem, most people call it. And then there's the psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior. Most people call that psych-soc. Which one's harder, for most people? I think that just varies. So most people, when they contact me and they say, boy, my score overall is pretty good, but I'm struggling in this one section, I would say 8 times out of 10, that one section is CARS.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be what stumps a lot of people. And then I would say the second most common that I hear is chem phys. And then I hear struggles with biochem and psych-soc a lot less. Now, that might change a little bit over time. So a lot of, medical school applicants are, of course, life science majors. So they've spent a lot of time just focusing on bio and biochem. And so that comes as something more natural to them, whereas chem phys might not be as strong for them. Obviously, CARS is not really science-based, even though it requires sort of the same reasoning skills as the other sections do. And then the psych-soc is interesting because, when the exam started, it was a little bit more about just memorize these terms, apply them in pretty simple scenarios. And folks found that to be the easiest section. I think as the test becomes more sophisticated and, the folks who make the test questions are seeing, how many folks get certain questions right and wrong, that question will probably begin to get more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, when some students have struggled on the psych-soc section, they're pretty surprised. They thought that was supposed to be the easy one. And I think over time, we'll start to see a bit more of that surprise about whoa, I thought I was supposed to do better in psych-soc. So I would say in terms of difficulty rankings currently, as far as what I hear from most people, it'll be CARS followed by chem phys, then biochem and psych-soc.
Gotcha. Now, in terms of how it's set up, there's passage-based questions where you read a passage, answer a few questions,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's freestanding questions. Now, I think
Mm-hmm.
something that comes up a lot with students is just how do you study for these passage, based questions? Because it's not necessarily, there is some content in there that you need to know, but, a lot of it is information from the passage that you got to integrate to then solve problems. So what advice do you have for students in terms of studying for those passage-based type questions?
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Sam. I find that a lot of students make the big mistake of thinking that when they struggle with a certain question, and this applies to both standalone questions as well as passage-based questions, they seem to think that it's an issue with their content knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, they'll read a passage about, let's say, mitosis or something like that, or something genetically relevant. And if they struggle with it, they go, oh, better study more genetics. And it's not that a student, if you get a passage-based question wrong or a set of passage-based questions wrong, it's not necessarily that you struggle with the content. It may very well be that your strategy is off. Okay. What do I mean by that? So some folks might, answer certain types of questions wrong when there's a variable involved, or main idea types of questions wrong. Because the passages, they give you information that's relevant to answering the questions. They also do provide some details that are not necessarily, they're irrelevant to the questions, but they're also meant to serve as distractors. I've noticed a lot of times where passages will put information in there that leads the student to assume something that wasn't explicitly said. And then they answer questions based on those assumptions and they get it wrong. So you have to practice from a strategy standpoint of, okay, what is this passage telling me? Also, what have they not explicitly told me and that I'm assuming? What's the main idea? What are the relevant details for that question? So some questions require you to just, process the information, take the main idea and answer. Others will require you to go back to the passage and look for them. So you have to get those reps in over and over again to see just how to approach different kinds of questions. And, on our YouTube channel, we were finding that a lot of students were struggling with that, but also finding it was really valuable to see someone go through it and really just answer those questions and explain their thought process along the way. So we started recording, MCAT passage walkthrough videos that, our students have found very valuable. It's just really nice to see, okay, how do the pros do it? Right.
Yeah.
And then think about, well, how am I doing it? And where's the gap between what I'm doing and what I ought to do? Because students also have natural approaches to the test, as far as some people read the questions first, then they go back to the passage. Some people read the passage first, digest it, then go to the questions. There is no just like there's no right or wrong way to eat a Reese's kind of thing. There's no right or wrong way to necessarily approach this, so long as it works with your natural tendencies.
At Med School Coach, we know that studying for the MCAT exam can be challenging, especially for busy students on the go. That's why our team created MCAT Prep, the only all-encompassing study app built specifically for the MCAT. MCAT Prep by Med School Coach provides student access to extremely high-quality content and a personalized curriculum for free. The app has more than 250 videos, 1,000 flashcards, and 1,000 unique MCAT questions. Plus, MCAT Prep by Med School Coach allows students to create a personalized study schedule and track progress over time. You need every competitive advantage you can get to get into medical school, and now you can put the experts from Med School Coach into your pocket. It's the closest pre-med students can come to a personal tutor without spending a penny. Download MCAT Prep by Med School Coach for free at medschoolcoach.com/MCAT. Or download it directly from the Apple Store or Google Play Store. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and MCAT Prep by Med School Coach can help.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about in my opinion, the worst section of them all, and this is predictable, is cars. Mm-hmm. What advice do you have in terms of studying for cars? That's another thing I think students study with, because it's like, do I just do a bunch of practice? Can I really dive in and figure out why I'm missing questions? Do I watch somebody do it? Like kind of what you're just talking about. What advice do you give students there?
Yeah, great question. So again, unsurprising that the biggest struggle for you was cars. Very typical. And I think it can get frustrating too, because it's not like with cars, you can go and study the content to give yourself a better foundation, right? It's not one of these things
frustrating.
Like, okay, if you just study these, if you study this, philosophy and history, then you'll be good for cars. It doesn't work that way, even though a lot of people wish it did, right? And so when it comes to cars, you really have to get good on strategy. Now, fortunately, if you're someone listening to this who, let's say, is a year, 2 years, 3 years out of taking the MCAT, read.
Yeah.
It's, it's going to sound like, well, yeah, duh, like read. But no, I'm serious, because the best thing you can do to develop your comprehension skills is to do it before you even have to start prepping for the MCAT specifically. And just developing that muscle where you're reading more, narrative forms of content, or whatever the case might be, different forms of literature and writing and stuff like that. You'll train that muscle just like anything else. Right. And because it's not a simple memorization of facts, it's not like, well, now I knew, the structure before studying the structure of benzene, I didn't know it. Now I studied it and now I know it. That's not how cars work. It's something that over time, you won't even necessarily notice it's happening, but you'll develop that muscle for good reading comprehension skills. Okay. So that's the first thing. But let's say you don't have that luxury. Let's say you're not a freshman listening to this, and you have an MCAT that's 3 months out, 4 months out, 6 months out, whatever the case might be. There are still strategies to take what you do have as a foundation and make it better. So we really encourage our students to develop passage outlines along the way, right? So if you're going through a passage, you read the first paragraph, jot down the main idea of that paragraph, maybe a couple words about, okay, this is what this paragraph's about. And not only does that help you go back to it to understand what the main point is and answer those main idea questions much more easily, but it also allows you to, the way you take notes in class, it's not just so you can study later, it's so that you can more easily committed to memory in the moment as well.
Mhm.
And that really helps. So you could say like, hey, paragraph 1, this is what that was about. Paragraph 2, this was what happened, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a big thing. Another thing we like to do is teach our students how to predict what's coming next. So you saw the first paragraph. Okay, what do you think is going to come next? Because that helps you build the like anticipation muscle about like types of questions that might be asked, or if there's a question and they're trying to, get me to figure out what the main idea is, or all that kind of stuff. Because when passages are provided to you, they're typically done pretty it's not like there are these clear logical gaps in them or whatever, but training that muscle of understanding, okay, what's coming next gives you the sense of what is this about. Okay. So that again reinforces over and over again. And then make sure to time yourself when you're going through the passages. So a lot of times people will, they'll go through it really slowly when they're prepping for the exam, when they take their practice tests at home, they had a beautiful night's sleep
Mhm.
and, they spend the full, a lot of time for each passage. Force yourself to work through it faster. Okay, maybe 2 minutes faster than you would than you have time for, because on test day, what happens, Sam? We all like hyper focus on the words. We read all the answer choices,
Drink too much
one
coffee
by one,
beforehand.
all that kind of stuff. We tend to slow down a little
Yeah.
bit, right? I don't know if that was your experience. And so we find ourselves like, man, on the practice problems I was doing really well, but on the actual test I found myself rushing at the end and stuff like that. So build in practice where you don't have the same luxury. Sleep less the night before when you do your practice exam. Give yourself less time to answer questions and all that kind of stuff, right? And in the beginning, when you're developing that CARS muscle, you might want to give yourself extra time. Go through it, understand it. What are they looking for? Be very deliberate in your practice. As time goes on, put on those time limits and just really pressure yourself to work through things quickly.
I like that a lot, and I wish honestly that I had heard that advice, back when I was studying. Is there a set kind of number of days a week that you should be doing CARS? If you struggle with CARS, is there some set days a week you should be doing it? What do you recommend to students there?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on where you are in your overall prep,
Okay.
right? Because let's say you have 3 months. This is
Mhm.
just for discussion's sake. Roughly, we recommend for the first third of MCAT prep that you're really focusing on, say, 70% content, 30% strategy. As you move to that latter 2/3 of your prep process, we ask that you flip it on its head. So you do 70% strategy, maybe 30% content. And as you're doing a lot of strategy work, CARS is really nice because the strategies you use in CARS actually apply really well to the other sections, right? Because they all require that sort of comprehension and applying, your understanding of the passage to answering questions, looking for text-based evidence, looking at questions first, and then looking at the passage and using the outline to answer. All that stuff matters. So I actually given how it sort of applies to the other sections, and the fact that most pre-med students do find it harder to go through CARS successfully, I like building it in routinely. So it's not like you would have like a CARS week and a non-CARS week or something
Gotcha.
like that.
Yeah.
Even when you're studying other sections, I think like incorporating CARS prep maybe even 2 days a week and then increasing it up from there as needed is a good idea, just to build that muscle in the background time and time again. Because again, this isn't something where you return to and say, oh, CREP cycle, I'll spend this day on CREP. No, it's not like that. It's something you really just have to get the reps in.
Yeah.
So my advice is like, there isn't really too much CARS prep. The other thing I'll say, Sam, you might know people who had this experience. You might have had this experience yourself. Sometimes MCAT preppers, they play a game of whack-a-mole. So, when you go to like the arcade or whatever, there's that game where those animals pop up and you're trying to hit them.
Oh yeah.
And you hit one, another one pops up, etc.
Yeah.
So if you turn over too much attention to CARS, what ends up happening, right? Your knowledge in the other areas might slowly atrophy and you're not knowing what's going on. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm so behind on CARS. And you're like rushing to, make sure that you do so well on CARS that maybe some of your knowledge in the other section sort of fades. So that's why I like to have it as like just a booster, just routinely in the background. so that you train on it and get a lot of reps in. But at the same time, you don't neglect the sciences, even though, you believe that you're much stronger in the sciences naturally.
I like that. I like the whack-a-mole analogy. That's good. So another question that I think I get a lot, or I hear a lot, is, how do you know when you're ready to take the MCAT? So for me, for instance, I studied for 3 months and then I just took it. But how do I know I'm ready to even take the MCAT once I've studied?
Yeah, I think there are a few things. It's not just like I've studied and am I ready now? Because usually, if you've studied, you've gone through all your practice, that you probably don't have that much time left to make that decision. So I think that deciding on how much time you need to prep for the MCAT really starts at the beginning. So first off, like, people who tend to do well on certain standardized tests, they tend to do better on other standardized tests, just because there is some crossover, right, as far as like comprehension and things. So if you did well in an earlier exam, say like the SAT or ACT and all that kind of stuff, you might have, more of that natural, standardized testing, comprehension type of skill, right?
Right.
And then also think about your GPA a little bit. So if your GPA is a little bit on the lower side, there are two things you have to consider. One, you might be a touch weaker in the sciences, and so you might need more time for content prep. Versus if you have a higher BCPM GPA, you might be stronger in the sciences, and so you might not have to have as long of a content heavy phase, right? That also really matters. And then also, if you have a lower GPA, well, now your MCAT needs to be even higher. So that also means you should spend a little bit more time. If you have a higher GPA, it's not like you want to, have a mediocre MCAT grade, but you might not need as much time to achieve your peak or close to peak score. So those things matter. And then take a really good diagnostic. I think that one of the problems with most diagnostic exams is that they focus a little bit too much on just giving you like section summaries. So you might get like a breakdown where it says, your score on this section is 122. This one is 125, etc. And then they say, oh my gosh, 122 in that section. I need to spend more time there. But that's kind of a gross measure, right? It doesn't actually tell you where you're strong and where you're weak within that specific section. And so figuring out, okay, like, let me study the patterns of my diagnostic exam. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? What types of questions do I tend to get right and wrong? And just really see, okay, is it just like one or two patterns, or am I just having an across the board issue? Like the types of problems I'm getting wrong, I don't really see a pattern, which is more problematic, right? Yeah. Because then it's sort of like, oh boy, I really have to, shore up a lot of gaps. Whereas if there are one or two sort of foundational issues, you can just in a really targeted way focus on those when it comes to strategy. I think that the sweet spot for most students is that 3 to 4 months range, just because if you do too much longer than that, you run into the whack-a-mole atrophy problem, where sometimes you're studying, something you studied 5 months ago you might not remember it as well anymore. So I think that 3 to 4 months is really nice. Now, if you have lower stats and you need a little more time on content and you're not naturally good at standardized. How many times have we heard sound like, I'm just not a good tester, that right. kind of thing. Then maybe a 4 to 6 months might be more reasonable for you. So that's roughly how I think about it. But honestly, the way that MCAT improvement goes, I wish it was a straight line. It's just not. What we tend to observe is more of like that hockey stick J curve, right? Where you're in the beginning, it seems like you're not really making a dent, but you're studying a lot of content, you're studying a lot of strategy. And then in that last month, there tends to be that like inflection point where we start to see bigger increases. So the way to know that you're doing really well, or that you're getting ready, is if you've experienced that. So you're going through it, maybe, you took some practice tests, now you're into your AAMC full length exams. Say you have like, I don't know, you hit a 507 the first time, a 511 the second time, then like 516 and 519, like that kind of jump. That's what we really like to see. And if you're getting that kind of thing, then you can, fairly confidently go into it. Mm-hmm. Another thing to consider is, what types of schools are you going for? What's your target score? It's not super common for a student to achieve way higher than what they did on their AAMC full lengths. Typically, it'll be at or slightly below. So consider that too. I've met, many students over the years who were like, what? I was scoring a 522 on my full lengths and then I got a 516 or something like that. So not to scare anybody, it's not like you're necessarily going to see a 6-point drop or drop at all, but that's something to keep in the back of your mind as well.
Yeah, and you talked about it earlier. I think what a lot of people don't think about is when you take the test, you're probably not going to be well rested. Your adrenaline's going to be pumping. It's a little bit of a different scenario than when you're sitting down in a comfortable, cool environment and you're just taking it. So that's something that students definitely need to think about and just consider when they're taking the test for real. And as you said, I've never given students this advice, but I kind of like it. Is maybe take the test when you're tired, or you didn't get a full night's rest, or you drank too much coffee, whatever it may be. Try to kind of almost simulate the test conditions that you're going to see on test day.
Super important, Sam. Thank you for reinforcing that. Yeah, if you're in your favorite hoodie, your sweatpants, your dog or your cat's on your lap, you feel super relaxed, got 8 hours of sleep. How often does that happen where you're fully rested, not feeling anxious, not feeling jittery on actual test date? Almost never, right? And so put yourself in that pressure cooker situation so that you can go in there with more confidence. Like, I've experienced this before. It's nothing new for me.
Yep. So do you ever give students the advice to postpone their tests, and kind of what goes into that decision?
I do from time to time. And it really depends on, again, all those factors of like, well, what cycle are they applying first and foremost? So if somebody, let's say, is applying during the following year. So let's say we're talking in 2021 right now, it's late May. And let's say someone's applying in 2022 and they're like, I really need to take the June exam. Well, actually, you don't really need to take the June exam, right? You might need that extra month, 2 months to prep, and you'll be just fine. Because it's not really going to impact your rolling admission cycle for next year. So that's a consideration there. When are you applying? When will you take the test, et cetera? It also depends on, okay, what is your actual score? Like sometimes people will, they'll be scoring on the full lengths around the 516 or something like that, and they'll be freaking out. They're like, I had to get a 524 and all that kind of stuff. It's like, well, actually, you have an amazing GPA, you go to a great school, multiple publications, you started this incredible initiative. We've helped students get into top 5, top 10 programs with, even 513, 514, all that kind of stuff. So it really depends on the specific scenario. Now, if a student is really just, really struggling, like they're getting somewhere between a 498 and a 502 or something like that, and they're like, I'm only going to apply to MDs and I have a 3.6. I don't care. It's like, whoa. Like we have to have a sit down first off to talk about like expectations and whatnot. But also, look, if you're going to take the MCAT and you're going to apply to the types of programs you want, schools take the highest score. So if you retake it and you do higher, they'll technically take that, but they can't really unsee the old score. Right? This isn't like the ACT or the SAT where you have score choice and you get to show schools what you want and you get to hide what you want, where they're going to see everything. And so, what is that going to look like on your record? And so if something's really low, we have to be mindful of that. The other thing we have to talk about is the pattern. So if we're seeing that really nice inflection, but you had less time to study, and so you can't take full advantage of that, that J curve, even 2, 3, 4 weeks more may allow you to get some questions right that you would have never before, and lead to a much higher score, right? Because as you go through the exam, so getting 4 points to go from a 516 to the 520 is much harder than going from like a 500 to a 504, right? There's simply less lower hanging fruit when you're trying to get points at the high end. So you really just have to make sure that you're thinking about where you are at that time. But yeah, I mean, it just really depends on, case by case where someone's at. But yeah, that's when I would, recommend maybe delaying a little bit.
Sure. So I want to switch over now and talk a little bit about how med schools kind of view the MCAT. So, med schools really claim to be holistic, and they take a broad look at kind of everybody as an applicant. And I truly believe that they do that. But would you say the MCAT is like the most important factor in getting into med school, or at least one of the most important factors?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is one of the most important factors. Whether it's the most important factor, I think that's subject to debate. because it's hard to say even between GPA and MCAT, which of those two is more important. And I think each of them, play a significant role for pretty obvious reasons. I mean, the GPA is sustained performance, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just like how did I do on that one day. But then the downside to GPA, of course, is that it's not standardized. So, we all know people who said, boy, I went to this really hard undergrad. If I had gone to this school, like my local, my friends from growing up, I would have had a 3.9. Now I only have a 3.6 and all that kind of stuff. But context matters, where you went to school, what your GPA was, all that kind of stuff. But then the MCAT's really nice in that it's standardized. But it's not just the total score that matters, right? So when we think about holistic admissions, it's not just like, MCAT plus GPA or whatever, but also the specifics. How did you do overall in the MCAT? What was the spread across sections? Did you have any sections that you totally bombed on and all this kind of stuff? I think the summary here, Sam, is that the MCAT and your GPA collectively, they're critical for establishing like your baseline competitiveness, right? So they're sort of like the ticket to get through the door, right? Mm-hmm. But they don't really impress too much beyond that. Like if you're applying to top schools, top 5, top 10, top 20, all that kind of stuff, everyone has amazing numbers, right? Or most people have really incredible numbers. And it doesn't really differentiate, but it is sort of your ticket. It's sort of the buy-in ticket, That's the way I see it.
That makes sense.
At Med School Coach, we know that matching into the specialty of your choice and the residency program of your dreams has a dramatic impact on your career as a physician. And your USMLE score is the most important acceptance factor of all. That's why more students than ever are turning to Med School Coach for USMLE tutoring. Our tutors are all 260 plus scorers and have been through rigorous training. Plus, the average student who uses Med School Coach tutoring raises their score by 23 to 55 points. There is an enormous amount of material you need to know for Step 1 and Step 2, and Med School Coach can help you be smart about how to study. We'll create a custom program just for you. Then, we'll help you master USMLE concepts where you need help most. You'll raise your USMLE score. We guarantee it. Visit us online at medschoolcoach.com and use offer code PODCAST10 to save 10% up to $400 on a Med School Coach USMLE tutoring package. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and Med School Coach can help.
Now, you mentioned kind of having a balanced score there. That's something I truly didn't think too much about when I was taking the MCAT. What should that look like? I mean, what do schools think if, for instance, you have, a 128 in psych soc, 131s in the sciences, but then you have like a 125 in cars? Is that something that's really going to hold you back?
It will impact your odds for sure. So ideally, what I hope students are able to achieve is a 126 plus in all 4 sections. It's really, really nice to have your lowest score be no less than a 126. When you get into the 125 and certainly the 124, that tends to be a problem. The reason I say that is because, when you go to MSAR, what you have to do, so MSAR, for folks who don't know, it's essentially the database for, med school admissions where all the MD programs supply, what their average GPA is, what their average MCAT is, and all this kind of stuff. But one of the nicest pieces of MSAR data is that they provide not only, the median numbers for MCAT and GPA and all that kind of stuff, they also give you the 10th, the 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th percentile scores for not just the MCAT total, but also subsection scores. And if you check out, a lot of great MD programs, you'll notice that a lot of times their 10th percentile score will be a 126 or higher, in any given section. Sometimes 125 or higher. But when you get into 124, that starts to become more and more rare. And so it would really take tremendous scores in the other sections to pull up, I say that in quotes, pull up, your 124 section. So balance is not, so your total score matters more than the specific section score profile. But ideally you'd have a pretty high total score and a 126 plus in all 4 sections. And if you have a 124 below in any section, you should strongly, in the majority of cases, you're going to seriously want to retake.
Yeah. And this is something I haven't really talked too much about, but I think my car's, if I remember correctly, my car score was actually 125, and I was a reapplicant, and I think a big reason that I was, or at least part of the reason I was because of that. And if I could go back, I think in retrospect, I think I would try to retake it and get above that, because that does, at least it seemed to me, kind of hold me back. So that's something definitely to think about as, you get your MCAT score back, and you try to figure out, what programs that you'll be able to get into. So with that said, what is a good MCAT score?
This is the $1 million question, Sam. And you're going to hate me for it. My answer, it depends,
Sure.
It really depends. And I say you're going to hate me for it. I say that, with tongue in cheek, of course, but a lot of times, as medical school applicants are like, they're looking for like the answer, like, okay, what's the score I need to hit to, to be reasonably assured of getting in? And that really depends on your GPA, but also the rest of your profile. So we actually have a guide on this on our site. It's called, I think, What MCAT Score Do You Need to Get into Med School? It's essentially answering like what is a good MCAT score for me? Well, of course, you have to think about the types of schools you're aiming for. So if you're looking at, really top schools versus, more mid-tier MD programs or lower tier MD programs and all that kind of stuff, check out the numbers roughly of what they're seeking, both on the, cumulative science GPA side, but also the, overall MCAT side. You want to make sure to hit those numbers. But there's also a bit of a, sort of like, think of it as like a XY kind of graph, right? Where the lower your MCAT score, the lower your GPA, the higher your MCAT score needs to be to make yourself competitive for MD programs in general. And then the higher your GPA, the more buffer you have. Now, of course, you might be competitive for MD programs, but the question of competitive for which MD programs, well, that depends on the specific combination. The nicest tool we have to figuring out, the type of MCAT score that you need is the AAMC actually provides some data where they talk about U.S. medical school acceptance rates in the past few cycles, where they essentially, graph they provide a table of GPA on one side, total MCAT score on the other side. And then based on various combinations of scores, you'll know the number of people who got into, matriculated into at least one, medical school, right? So for instance, if somebody has between a 3.60 and a 3.79 total GPA, and they achieved between a 510 and a 513 MCAT score, the acceptance rate to, at least one MD program was 62.1%. Okay. Now, if you take the same GPA and, you look at 514 to 517, it's 72.2. If you go to 518 to 528, it's 78.6. So clearly the higher up you go in GPA and the higher up you go in MCAT, the better your odds get. Now, the issue with those data is sometimes people think like, oh, I only have an X% chance of getting in with my stats. That's actually not quite the conclusion you should come to, because those numbers say nothing about where you did your undergrad. They say nothing about your cumulative or science GPA, your extracurriculars, the strength of your rec letters, essays, interviews, and all that kind of stuff. Because because you have the 3.80 to 4.0 and the 518 to 528 range, that's 86.6%. So what's happening to the remaining 13.4, right? What was it? Did they not have enough hours in certain areas? Did they just bomb interviews? So it is a holistic picture, right? But clearly the higher up you go, the better it is. Now, sometimes people will say, should I stop taking? When should I know that it's good enough? Again, depends on your GPA and the rest of your profile. We've had students who, have really terrific GPAs, 3.9, maybe had a 513, but their extracurricular profile was excellent. And they ask, should I retake it? I'm aiming for a top 20 school. And we actually advised them not to. And they ended up having success that they wanted. And it just really depended on how terrific they were when it came to their resume. So it's super case by case. Ideally, you're going to want to have in the 5 teens. So like 513 and up, that would be really, really nice, because the average matriculant score is a 511. But that's how you really want to think about it.
Gotcha. Very good. Well, I want to end with kind of a little bit of a, not controversial, but interesting question, which is, do you think the MCAT will ever go pass fail? It seems like, step one for med school just went pass fail. It seems like a lot of things are going that direction. Is there any chance that the MCAT will ever go pass fail?
This is just purely my prediction,
Of course.
not based on anything official I've heard. My thought is not anytime soon.
Okay.
Right. For a number of reasons. One is, standardized tests. So standardized tests in general have come under fire, right? We get a lot of this when we're talking about college admissions, right? Where we're talking about, the SAT and the ACT, what's the value in that, all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, having a standardized measure is really, really valuable to schools to know, okay, look, yes, one student went to undergrad program A, the other one went to undergrad program B, but how do you actually compare their academic, abilities or their ceiling or whatever the case might be? And it's imperfect, don't get me wrong, right? It's not like perfectly predictive. Some students simply struggle or have fewer resources to prep for it. I get all of that, but it's still a very helpful metric for schools. The other thing is that there's a conflict of interest, right? The AAMC runs the MD admissions process. They also run the MCAT. So, it's very lucrative for them too. And I don't know why they don't really have a need necessarily to get rid of it. If it was going to happen, it's going to be driven by the schools, where they're going to say, we don't care anymore, or it's optional, or we don't look at it, or whatever the case might be. And, obviously there are some schools now that are going test optional or have gone test optional, and they did during last cycle because of COVID and all the cancellations and stuff like that. But whether that's the start of a larger trend, or versus just like a crazy time in history, and out of necessity we did that, and schools will give a little bit of leeway to students for the next few cycles. That's what I think is going on, but hey, I might be wrong about it. I just don't see it going anywhere for now.
And I think I totally agree with you. I think it's here to stay. I just don't know what other factors admissions committees would look at. They got to have some objective number, and I think the MCAT is part of that. So I agree. Now, would you like to shout out any of your websites, blog posts, kind of where can people find some of the resources that you guys have?
Yeah, going to our site, ShemmassianConsulting.com. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, so it's I'm sure you'll link to it in the show notes, Sam. So Shemmassian. But also, easy way to find it would be if you Google something, you can write like medical school personal statement, Shemmassian, and then, I assume that the appropriate guide would come up. And if anyone ever wants to, reach us, there's contact forms on the site. You can get in touch, and it would be a pleasure.
Awesome. And honestly, you can Google a lot of the MCAT topics, and you guys come up first, and especially as well for the secondary essay blog post. So I don't know who's doing your SEO content, but they're doing a great job because it's you guys come up first, like on a lot of those things.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. Yeah, I'm just glad that it's valuable to
Yes, very, very, very helpful. Well, this was fantastic. I really appreciate your time, and I think students will find this discussion helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Appreciate you having me.
Each episode of MCAT Basics is brought to you by Med School Coach. To access Med School Coach services, including MCAT tutoring and medical school admissions advising, visit our website at medschoolcoach.com. Good luck as you prepare for the MCAT, and we hope you tune in again next time.